So hello, welcome again, and I'm recognising quite a lot of faces and names now. Now it's on our penultimate talk. For those who don't know, I'm Rachel Bailey, and online we have Becca Duncan, who is the co-organiser of this series of talks looking at sustainable design solutions for the landscape industry. These talks are kindly supported by Zero Waste Scotland, and we have Nick Ribbons of Zero Waste Scotland online with us. Just to, if you didn't hear before, this talk's going to be recorded and it will be widely distributed afterwards. So if you don't want to be seen in the recording, please turn off your video. If you've got any questions, if we can leave them to the end, and we encourage you actually to please hold your, you can actually ask your question at the end. If you don't want to ask a question in person, please put it in the chat and Becca and I can ask it for you. So tonight we're going to be hearing from Dr. Davide Dominoni on the subject of the effects of garden lighting on wildlife and design solutions to minimise these effects. Davide is a lecturer in urban ecology at Glasgow University, and he's interested in understanding the impacts of urbanisation and human activities on wildlife, with the ultimate goal of suggesting conservation actions and policy changes that will limit such impacts. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to yourself, Davide. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure. And I mean, it's not traditionally the audience that I talk to, and you have to excuse me if sometimes, I go too much into scientific details. I'll try to keep it as broad as possible for you. And I'm going to share right now my screen. Okay. Well, good, huh?
Yes, that's good, thanks.
Okay, so as Rachel said, I'm a lecturer in urban ecology. Urban ecology has always been, in a way, my scientific passion. I always wanted to understand the impact of human activity, particularly in urban areas, on wildlife. So this has always been my topic, basically since the start of my academic career, since I did my PhD. And through the years, light pollution has really become sort of my thing, my specialty in a way. Although, as I said, my interest is really broadly in urban ecology speaking, and I'm gonna just start now quite broadly from an urban ecology context, and then try to nail it down more into the light pollution problem. And I think one of the first things to realize is that the world is really becoming more and more urban. Since basically 2000 and I think it's around 2008, 2009, there was this passing point where we had basically more people living in urban areas than in rural areas, and this is becoming more and more the case right now. So this actually now this curve of the rural population is now basically decreasing, as more and more people are moving into urban areas. And as more and more people are moving into urban areas, obviously that creates a lot of pressure on the natural ecosystems and on the species that live in there, because obviously these urban areas will automatically start to grow in size. There are some countries, for instance, I used to live in Germany quite a lot for 5-6 years, and there they really are paying attention to urban design and how to build cities. So actually, although more people are moving into German cities, the German cities are not expanding so much in area. But in other countries of the world, that's not the case. If you think about the US or a lot of developing countries, so that really creates pressure on the natural habitat. And scientists have started to really pay attention to this as well. And this is just basically a search of papers with the keyword urban ecology that I did in a scientific database. And you can see how the number of scientific papers that are published on the topic of urban ecology has been increasing exponentially in the last 50 years. Really, now in 2020, I think it was more than 50,000 papers that were published. So it's really. I remember when I published the first paper in this field, and I mentioned that urban ecology was a growing field. One of the people who reviewed the paper told me, well, not really. Urban ecology is really an established field of research, and it is indeed. Now it's really, we have a lot of specialized journals that focus on this topic, and there is really growing interest. And I think the reason why we should study the effect of urbanization on ecosystem and on wildlife are really threefold. First is because, as I just mentioned, is a global and increasing phenomenon. Okay, so our world is becoming more urbanized, and urban land is one of the few land types that are increasing all over the world. We are losing forest. We are losing grasslands. We are losing a lot of different habitat types. But the urban land is one of the lands that are still increasing and will increase. So the projection for the future are really grim in this sense. So there is increasing pressure to really start to think about how we should build our cities to make sure that we maximize biodiversity and we create healthy and sustainable ecosystems. And one of the reasons why we need to do that is because there is evidence that the way that these cities are currently built, in most cases, is actually quite bad for animal and for ecosystem health. So a lot of species, fewer species that are able to make it into urban areas, they often are doing not so well. There's obviously some exceptions. To think about pigeons, for instance. But in general, urban species tend to suffer a bit. And then, from a very much scientific point of view, for us as urban ecologists, and especially in terms of evolution, natural selection, it's a fantastic laboratory where we can study natural selection acting on species right here and right now. Because cities are relatively novel environments. So species have been exposed to the pressure of the urban environments for a relatively short period of time on a sort of geological time scale. And therefore, there's a lot of examples of species that are currently adapting to this environment, inventing new ways that they can survive. Many species, will definitely succeed in that and will manage to colonize and be successful in urban environments. But the key question here is that how we can make sure that more species can do that in the future. And the urban environment, many people try. When I talk about the urban ecology to many non-specialists, they always look at me like, but as a scientist, don't you want to go to, tropical forests and really study, cool places with a lot of biodiversity? And my answer normally to this type of question is that, well, if you look carefully, there's actually a lot of species that live in urban areas. We regularly catch and monitor birds along an urban gradient here in Glasgow, and there's always more species that we find, especially in the suburban areas, in the fringe between urban and rural lands, that we actually can see and catch in more rural and forest area outside of Glasgow. It's really they can really be a rich environment from a biodiversity point of view if they're managed in the right way. And this is also supported by a lot of scientific evidence. This is just some examples from birds here on the left, different types of indexes of biodiversity, from a mere number of species, or indexes that take into account also the abundance of each species. or just a number of birds, or like a number of birds per area, so a measure of density. And for birds, it's really clear that we have more birds at the interface. So in these suburban areas, here you have for each of these graphs, you have the business district on the left hand side, more natural habitat on the right hand side. And you see that all these bars, they peak in the middle of these graphs, right? Indicating that you have more bird biodiversity usually in these suburban areas. For mammals, if you look at a diversity index, that's also the case. But if you look just at a purely abundance index, we still tend to have more mammals in rural areas compared to downtown areas. But the overwhelming evidence, not for only bird and mammals, but many other species, is that really in suburban areas, there is a possibility to create environments that are really able to sustain a lot of biodiversity.
Sorry, Davide, sorry, can I just interrupt? Nick, can you let some other people in, please? Oh, sorry, carry on, Davide.
Yeah, no problem. What I was mentioning before about, that some species can make it in urban area, but some other cannot. And this is one of the most common consequences of urban sprawl, is that it tends to homogenize wildlife. So that in every city, you always find the same species, because those are the species that make it through this sort of urban filter. Only the species that have certain traits can make it through this filter, and some other species that do not have the good enough traits to be urban species, they are they are bounced back from this filter. It's what we call this process is what we call biotic homogenization, and this is really where I think there is an opportunity to make the urban environment more suitable for also the species that usually are intolerant to urban life and cannot make it through this filter. It's clear that one of the traits that make species adaptable and successful in urban environments is their degree of flexibility. So for instance, this is just an example of bird species and really their different nesting strategies that they're able to use in urban environments. Many bird species that can basically use a lot of man-made structures to make their nests. But these are common examples of species that are also common urban birds, and they're able to make it into urban habitats. Many other species, they are not able, they don't have this degree of flexibility. And so it's really important for the species that are not able to use man-made structure that we maintain suitable nesting habitat for them. Another thing that I want to just briefly mention is that obviously in all this process, humans are a direct driver. It's not only an indirect driver the way that we manage our cities that then has a consequence on biodiversity, but we can also be direct drivers of biodiversity in urban areas. This is just an example on the left-hand side of a study that was published a few years ago from the United States, where they really look across the whole country a correlation between socioeconomic, so basically median family income, you see here on the x-axis of this graph, and the number of plant species that you can find. And we see that this direct positive relationship between the two. The richer basically the neighborhood, the richer the garden where the data was collected, the more plant species they were able to sample. And this is because people tend to plant a lot of different plant species when they have the money to do so. And this can actually cascade also on the biodiversity of other organisms. This is something that I will try to talk about later on in the talk. On the right-hand side, this is another example. This is from actually South Africa, where they actually show that there is an interaction between this relationship between the median income and biodiversity, depending on the amount of urban cover. So depending on where you actually sample, and within a city, you might have a positive or negative relationship. And this is because, for instance, if you go really in downtown areas, in the business district, where these tend to be usually rich areas, but really in these areas of the city, in this part of the city, there's really not much green space. So here, the relationship between median income and species richness tend to be negative. And so it's really in suburban areas where there is space to plant species and to basically increase biodiversity, is that we have this relationship between median income and species richness. One of the key things, I think, key processes that are governing this relationship between urbanization and biodiversity is really the way that these urban areas are built, and the way that green areas are embedded within the urban matrix. This is often referred to as either land sharing type of management or land sparing. So fundamentally, is it better to have an environment like this on the left inside, where you have lots of small green areas embedded within a matrix, or is better to have environments like this, where you have a large green area within lots of basically concrete? And the answer is not so clear here. Also, from a lot of the scientific papers and scientific studies that focus on this, is that it's clear that there is not a unique answer to this question, and probably a mix of both strategies is good. Perhaps areas like this, the land sharing option with lots of small gardens, could favor biodiversity as a whole, but to have these large green areas, these large urban parks, is especially beneficial to rare species, or species that need quite a lot of space to survive. And this is just a picture that was taken a few days ago of a snowy owl in Central Park in New York City. Obviously, snowy owl is species you would never expect in this kind of environment, but because of the very cold weather, they tend to move south from Canada and from the northern US in this period of the winter. And apparently, Central Park, because it offers, it's a large green areas, offer a lot of different potential hunting places. It has been chosen by the snowy owl where to winter, basically, where to pass its winter. So I just wanted to mention this because I thought that could be relevant for some of the work and some of the interest that you have. One thing that I also wanted to point out is that obviously cities are very complex environment. I mentioned a few things so far, but what I really want to stress with this slide especially, but in general, in my talk, is that there are a lot of different environmental factors that make cities unique, and we need to think about each and every of them if we want to, design cities in the best way for wildlife and for biological diversity. So for my talk, I will obviously focus from now on light pollution, but I also want to mention other environmental factors like air pollution, noise, the availability of anthropogenic food, the overall warmer microclimate in cities that might, in some cases, might actually be also beneficial, especially during the winter time, and also the presence of novel plant species that might or might not be good for wildlife, depending on how useful they could be for native species. From now on, I will just focus on light pollution, since this is the topic of this talk. And obviously, when I start talking about light pollution, I cannot not start from this map. This is a map of the current levels of light pollution taken from a satellite in the sky, and it really gives you a good impression of the size of the issue, basically, especially in developed countries, Europe, the US, some areas of India and China, Japan, some areas of the Middle East, a few areas in Africa as well, and South America. It's clear that there's basically no left dark place. We really need to, species really need to live in an environment that is deprived of darkness, and this is also true for us human beings. It might also have an impact on our own health, and I will mention just briefly a few things later on. And obviously, this is a relatively novel. I mean, the electric lights have been invented and started to use basically 150 years ago, more or less. And from the late 50s, we have data from the satellites. This is an example from the US, where you can clearly see how the impact of light pollution, the extent of the issue, has been growing exponentially in the last 70 years. Before, it was mostly a problem of the west of the US, but now you can see that the problem has extended basically almost everywhere. There's only a few areas left in the West that are not exposed to light pollution. And the consequence of this is that the consequence of the invention of electric lights and the use and misuse of electric lights is that we have transformed our way of living. We really have become a 24-hour society. We never stop. And shops are open all the time. There's lights on all the time, and the key question is what is the consequence of all this for humans as well as for wildlife alike? And one of the reason why this is an interesting question from a scientific point of view, but also a very worrisome question, is that as human beings, but as basically almost any other organism on the planet, we have evolved in an environment that is rhythmic by nature. And this rhythmicity is mostly driven by natural alternation of day and night, or a natural change of photoperiod throughout the year that creates a season. And this is also true for moon cycles. So, lunar cycles that are driven by the light of the moon. And many species, including us, as I said, we have evolved in this environment that is rhythmic by nature, driven by these light cycles. And suddenly we are living in an environment that is deprived of, in most cases, of these light cycles, or at least where these light cycles are damped by the presence of light pollution. So the alternation between, the difference between dark and bright is not as clear as it used to be. And the reason why this is it might be important for our health and the health of wildlife is that by evolving in this environment that is cyclic, that is rhythmic by nature, we have also evolved mechanism to keep track of time, and a lot of our body physiological functions, they peak at certain time of day or night, depending on when it's best for them to peak, to ensure that these physiological processes are running as they're supposed to. If you're interested in this topic, I suggest this marvelous book. It's called Rhythms of Life. It's written by Russell Foster, who is a scientist in Oxford. And Leon Kreitzman is a journalist, so they team up and wrote this book that is really a pleasure to read. And as I mentioned, a lot of physiological or behavioral functions, they peak at certain time of day or night. The best coordination is just after lunchtime. Same for the reaction time. Testosterone secretion peaks early in the morning. And there's also some very interesting circadian rhythms in immune function. This is just a recent example, very beautiful study where they look at the time that it takes to wounds to heal, depending on whether the initial harm, basically the initial, this was, I think, wounds due to skin-borne burns. And what the scientists have shown is that the daytime wounds, they heal much more quickly than those suffer at night. On average, it takes 1 day longer for nighttime wounds to heal compared to daytime wounds. And this is because there is an innate circadian rhythm in immune function, in wound healing, that is more efficient at day than at night, basically. And in humans, there is a lot of research showing now that this is, doing shift work, for instance, is bad for our health. Being active during the night, eating at night, for instance, is extremely bad for our physiology, for our metabolism. There are also some studies suggesting a link to cancer, for instance. So really, really interesting, but worry studies that have come up in the last 10 years, basically. The key question for ecologists like me is, what is the effect on wildlife, basically? And this is really an emerging topic of research, I can say. This is one of the first sort of really, comprehensive book that was published on the topic, and it was in, I think, 2007. This is an example from, in the recent Planet Earth 2 by David Attenborough. He had a whole episode on cities, and one of the examples that he showed was a light pollution example of these hatching turtles. Was really interesting to see, basically, that in prime time television there is also interest in this topic. And also several newspapers started to devote attention on the ecological effects of light pollution, which is also, I think, very, very good, very positive, and very promising for the future. It's really a blossoming field, as I showed you before the graph for the number of papers published in the urban ecology field. I show you the same one for the light pollution field, and the same. This is turned the other way around compared to the first one. But you can see that in 2020, there were almost 8,000 papers published in this topic. And, 25 years ago, there were only not even 1,000. So really an exponential growth of interest in this topic. And I want to just start by sort of synthesizing what is the evidence so far, just to give you a few bullet points, and then I will dig more into details and give you some examples. So the first thing is that the evidence so far shows clearly that many species can change their daily, lunar, or annual natural cycles in light polluted areas. The most negative effects are found for phototactic, so animals that are attracted to light, especially animals that are usually prey, okay, like for instance insects, but also for migrating or animals that use natural light sources like the moon or the stars to navigate at night, to move at night. Also for these animals, the effects tend to be quite bad. As I mentioned, insects can be particularly negatively affected, but the nature and of the effect and also the consequence of the effect tend to depend on many different things, including on the intensity of the light that is applied in a certain area, and also the color of the light, the wavelength of the light. And I will mention this in detail later on. It's good to distinguish between different types of light pollution and their effect. A lot of attention is, and possibly for your own interest, this is the most relevant one. A lot of researchers focus on the direct illumination, so the effects of direct illumination, direct light pollution on the ground, and the effect that this has on the wildlife that lives on the ground. But we're starting to realize that sky glow, so light that basically goes towards the sky, and by reflecting against the atmosphere and against the cloud can create this glow. The effects of the sky glow can be actually as bad. And we also need to think about this sort of light pollution if we want to minimize its impact. And there's also evidence that though for some species, the presence of light pollution can actually be beneficial. So some species can actually exploit bright nights, can exploit light polluted areas for their own benefit. And again, I will give you a few examples about this. I also want to mention briefly, give you some example of really the nature of the effects. What are the mechanisms, physiological, ecological mechanisms behind these effects of light pollution? And we published a paper last year that tries to sort of summarize, that gives a framework to this mechanistic view of the effects of light pollution. And we came up with basically three major types of ecological effects, ecological mechanisms, sorry. One is the masking of natural light cues, so the presence of light masks the presence of moon and stars that some animals and other organisms might use. Light can distract animals from their target, might make them lose time, sometimes might actually increase their mortality as well. And light can also mislead organisms to the wrong cue, to the wrong place. I'm going to give you some examples of this, starting actually from this misleading mechanism. This is one of the most reported example. Is also for its location and for the scale of its impact. This is one of the most known example. This is the Tribute in Light. Is event that takes place every year in New York City. Is a September 11 memorial event where this two huge blue light beam are shot into the sky as a memory for the people who died during the Twin Towers event. And you can see here in this, all these small dots that you can see inside these huge beams of light. These are birds, okay? These are all birds that get trapped into these beams of light. Basically, they get disoriented. They keep flying over and over until they are exhausted and fall down and die. This happens in September, obviously, September 11. And September is a key migratory season. So birds normally, when they migrate between their from their breeding ground, they migrate down south to their wintering grounds. That's the time that usually it happens during the year. In the northern hemisphere, this wintering migration happens more or less between September and early October. And so this is a key migratory season for these animals. And the east coast of the US is a key migratory routes for the birds that normally breed at higher latitudes in Canada, very high latitudes. And they need to move south in the south of the US or even to South America to winter. And they use, they use the coastline as one of the topographical cue that they use to direct their, these migratory movements towards the right direction. And by passing by New York City, they can get trapped. And in any given night, there is hundreds, even thousands of birds that die because of this. And so when this evidence started to be collected by scientists, this had basically immediate impact on policy. When this paper was published, it had an immediate impact. And now this memorial is much more reduced. So before, these lights were kept on for days, right? During, every night for the whole night. Whereas now they tend to reduce the time. It happens only for, say, 10, 20 minutes, and then these lights are turned off. Just to give these migrating birds a chance to escape from this trap and continue moving south, moving towards the right direction. This is again one of the most common example of the misleading effects of light pollution. This is an example on hatching turtles. So hatchlings of turtles, when they, most often the eggs of turtles, they are laid on the beach, and when the hatchlings hatch, they use the light from the moon that reflects on the sea to move towards the sea, and that's the place where they want to go. But the presence of lights of light pollution in coastal areas, they often mislead these hatching turtles towards the wrong direction, towards inland and not towards the sea. And the result is that most of these hatching turtles, they end up dead, basically, because they cannot make it back towards the sea. This again was one of the things that was mentioned by Attenborough during his last Planet Earth 2 show. So again, this is a very strong impact. Hundreds of these hatching turtles can die in any given night because of these misleading effects of coastal light pollution. An example of the distracting effects of light pollution can be that of wildlife crossing roads and suddenly being distracted distracted and blinded by car lights, and they don't know what to do, and they obviously most often they end up being hit and killed. And this is true for deer, but also for smaller animals, for instance, frogs. It happens quite often also for frogs and toads. And last, I wanted to also show you an effect for an example of these masking effects. And this is an example on corals. So again, an example from marine sort of light pollution. And on corals, when they spawn, they tend to do it all at the same time to maximize their reproductive success. So they're all, all this to be out there all at the same time and to maximize their reproductive success. The presence of light pollution, though, to synchronize these mass spawning events, they often use the light from the moon. And the presence of light pollution in coastal areas, they basically mask the presence of the moon. These corals, they don't know anymore when is the right time to spawn. And the result of this is that these mass spawning events, they're not mass spawning events anymore. They are very much desynchronized, and they can happen anytime during, say, 2 or 3 weeks. And the result of this, the reproductive success is much lower because this synchronization is lost. I want to give you some examples also that might be a bit more relevant also for the type of interest that you might have in this topic. This is an example of research on wood mice. And this is an example of a study in the Netherlands where they use actually different types of colors of light and look at the effect. It was an experimental study that they did in the field and look at the effect of different colors of light on the activity of wood mice during the night. And they basically show that no matter what light color you use, as soon as you turn on the light, these mice disappear. And this is a clear and very common example of light pollution on nocturnal prey species. Obviously, these wood mice, they tend to be out there when there is not really much light. For instance, they tend to avoid full moon nights to be active. And this is because there is a lot of predators, they use visual cues to hunt them, and they're more active during full moon night. The presence of light pollution basically almost simulate a constant full moon, and therefore continuously suppress the activity of these mice that are basically forced to move away from these areas and try to find darker areas where to be active. There are some other species that might lack nocturnal predators, especially in urban areas, like some diurnal birds that actually show the opposite effect, so the opposite response to light pollution. These are examples on some diurnal birds, like the European blackbird, very common bird in urban areas, but also coastal birds that are common also in coastal urban areas, like shorebirds. They actually tend to be more active at night when there is light pollution, because these very often they tend to be visual foragers. So they need to see to forage, and the presence of light pollution extend the amount of time that they can use during the 24 hours to find food and forage. And this might be might have very positive effects on their survival, especially during winter when it's very cold and they need to basically feed as much as possible in order to build enough energy to survive very long and cold nights. The presence of light pollution can increase their foraging behavior at night and increase their foraging intake. Within the same, there are some examples that are very interesting where, within the same animal group, for instance, this example in bats, you might have complete opposite impacts depending on the ecology of the species. So these are examples from on the left-hand side. You have an example of a study done either on meiotis bats. On the right-hand side, you have the same study replicated on pipistrellus bats. And the difference between these two species, these two group of species, is that basically the meiotis species, they tend to, they're not very mobile bats. Their flight is a bit more clumsy, and they're not very fast flyers, and they really tend to be more active during very dark nights. That they don't want to forage and they're also visual foragers. They don't tend to forage in very in full moon nights, for instance, because they cannot find their prey as efficiently as in the dark, basically. So the presence of light pollution really suppressed their activity during in this experiment. But the effect was reversed when the scientists use red light, which gives, and I'm gonna talk a bit more in detail about these wavelength dependent impacts. But it seems that, especially in this case, using warmer colors of light can be more beneficial, can minimize at least the impact of light pollution on these species. On the right-hand side, these pipistrellus species are much more agile flyers. They love to catch their prey during these very fast flights. And the presence of light pollution, which is known to attract insects, which obviously they tend to fly also quite fast, it actually turns to be quite beneficial for the species of bats, because of their ability in flying. They are very successful in finding and catching their prey close to street lamps. So insects, they tend to be attracted by the street lamps, and these very fast flyer bats, they are able to exploit this increased presence of insects around street lights. And here it seems that again there is quite a wavelength dependent impact. It's not really clear why yet, but again it seems that the red light seems really not to make much difference compared to in this case the control dark group, but especially the effect was the activity of the species of bats was much increased when white light was used. And one interesting thing that I also want to mention here briefly is that there might very well be this, what we call in scientific terms, these co-evolutionary arm races between predators and prey. In other words, obviously, this, for instance, this example of the bats, they are able to exploit these nocturnal insects that are attracted to street lamps, especially moths. But at the same time, obviously, moths don't want to be eaten by these bats. So they might try to evolve strategies in order to avoid being eaten. One of the strategies that they came up with is to reduce their phototactic behavior. This is an experiment, very nice experiment that was done on this small moth. It's a ermine moth species, very common European moth. And basically, in this experiment, what the researchers were able to show is that these ermine moth, they were captured in urban areas. They were tested for their responsiveness to light. They show a much more reduced flight to light, so much more reduced phototactic behavior compared to the same species when the individuals were caught in rural areas with no light pollution. In other words, where their message in this paper was that the moths in urban areas that they have been exposed to light pollution for a considerable amount of time, they are evolving reduced sensitivity to light in order to avoid being attracted to the street lamps and therefore avoid being eaten. So very, interesting, sort of natural selection, pathway through which some of these species might adapt to the presence of light pollution. Just want to also mention a few slides about our own research here in Glasgow. One of the first thing that we focus on, 10 years ago, basically, was to actually try to measure how much light pollution is a common urban animal usually exposed to at night. This is a study that we did on the European blackbird, where what we did was to capture them and put some a radio transmitter on their back to basically follow them, track how much they were active during the day and during the night, and the effect of light pollution on how much they were active at night. But at the same time, what we also used was this small micro logger that was also mounted on the back of this bird. And this enabled us to measure basically real time on birds, so directly on the back of the bird, how much light these animals were exposed to. And the answer is here. This is the data, both sort of this is the average value and this is the maximum values that this animal were exposed to at night. And you can see that the level is considerably lower to what you can measure underneath a usual street lamp. Very common street lamp, if you measure on the ground, you measure a light level of between 5 and 10 lux. Lux is the unit of measure of light intensity. But these blackbirds were exposed on average to much lower levels, below 1 lux. But the question is whether these levels are still relevant from an ecological point of view. So here on the right, you have a table where you can see usual light intensity values for different light sources. So for instance, full sunlight, we are talking about 103,000 lux on average, okay? What you can measure in a residential street, so on average, street lamp luminance, as I mentioned before, was about 5 lux. Urban sky glow is about 0.1 lux. The full moon is about 0.1 lux, between 0.1 and 0.3 luxes. So these levels that we measure on these blackbirds, they're still very comparable to levels, so natural levels of light, like full moon, which basically tells us that basically there is the potential for these birds to be constantly exposed to full moon levels of light pollution. which obviously might be bad, might be good. We don't know. For the blackbirds, we have some evidence that it's not that bad, as I showed before, with this increased foraging efficiency at night. But for some other species, might actually be quite bad. Some other studies that we did was to try to look at whether there was a light intensity dependent effect on this nocturnal activity that many bird species show in urban areas. It's very common for birds, especially during this period of the year, to hear them singing at night. The blackbirds, the previous example, they do a lot, and they do it much more in light polluted areas compared to dark areas. We did another experiment on another very common urban species, the great tit, and here we show, focus on these black symbols. We show that as you increase the amount of light pollution at night, when they start to be active in the morning, so the onset of activity in the morning was much earlier. So here, the highest treatment that we used was 5 lux, so what you can measure under a street lamp. And in these cases, they were waking up basically almost 5 hours before the natural sunrise. So very strong effects, and these effects, they tend to increase as you increase light intensity. The key question that I always get when I give this talk is whether other urban factors might play a role in driving these differences in these daily rhythms of these urban birds. And so we did also some experiments, try to sort of disentangle the effect of light from the effects of other very typical urban factors that might have an impact on the activity of birds. And one very, very common urban factor that always comes up is urban noise, traffic noise. Obviously, if a bird is sleeping at night and hears a car passing by, or any other types of man-made sound at night, this might interfere with their sleep, might make them wake up earlier. So we try to do an experiment to disentangle these effects. And the results are here. So we have different group of birds exposed to no light and no noise, birds exposed to only noise, birds exposed to only light pollution, and birds exposed to light and noise pollution. And what we show here in this study is that basically noise has a very little effect on the time of the onset of activity. So when they're waking up in the morning, light had a very strong effect, and the light effect alone or the effect of light plus noise were very comparable. So at least for this species, we were able to show that light is clearly the main driver of this nocturnal behavior by these usually diurnal birds in urban areas. I also want to, as I mentioned before, talk a bit about wavelength and color-dependent effects of light. This is a project that I was part of when I did my postdoc in the Netherlands. I was working in the Netherlands Institute of Ecology. We had a project funded by the Dutch Science Foundation, but also by companies like Philips, that were very interested in trying to develop light sources that are wildlife friendly. So they funded us to try to investigate the effects of different colors of light on wildlife. I was the person responsible for the bird research, but the project was very ecosystem based in its nature. So there were many more people who were studying plants, insects, mammals, really all the different kind of species that you might find in the Netherlands. And so in this project, we had installed different street lamps with different colors in different forests. And we tested the red color, we tested the green color, and we tested a very commonly used sort of warm white light source. These were all LED lights, because obviously there is a huge push now for city council to convert from the old type of light bulbs to LED light sources because they're more efficient, so they can save money basically. And I just want to show you one of the studies, one of the results that we found. Again, a study on the graded, where we show that here the color-dependent effect on this nocturnal activity were extremely clear. So as soon as you start to use, to measure the activity of these birds in this white light transects, you can see that there was much more nocturnal activity by these species. But if you implement different type of light colors, either green or red, then their activity did not differ from the normal activity that they would show in dark areas, which suggested by tuning the spectrum of the light, we really can have a dramatic and quite fast impact on the normal behavior of these animals. And this, you can also see that this effect of the white light was dependent on the distance from the lamppost, from the street light, basically, which again suggests there might also be some intensity dependent effect. If you're more far away from the light source, obviously the intensity of the light will also be lower. And we show also here that this is able to reduce this nocturnal activity. So both the wavelength, but also the intensity play a very important role. The key question is whether, why do these birds do it at all in these urban areas? Why do they wake up earlier? And the answer is that, by waking up earlier, they are able to increase their reproductive success. They're usually able to sire more offspring. Potentially, this is one of the consequences of what I was mentioning before, the fact that by being more active at night, they can also forage more and perhaps, be themselves the parents in a better body condition, in better health, but they're also able to find more food for their offspring. And so in this data from Glasgow is currently not published, so we're still working on it, but it's quite clear that basically here on the x-axis, on the right-hand side, these female gratids, they wake up later in the morning. On the left-hand side, this is when they wake up earlier. And you can see that there's a quite good negative relationship between this trait and the number of chicks that they're able to produce. Basically, the earlier they wake up, the more they're able to sire offspring. So there's quite a good relationship between the two. This relationship is also true in the forest, not only in the city, which means that it's really important for these birds to try to maximize the time that they spend out there during the early hours of the day and try to find the food during these early hours. The question is whether there might be also some negative consequences of this nocturnal behavior, this being active at night, basically. And this really is a strong focus on a project that we currently are working on. It was funded by the government, by one of the research council of the government, NERC. It's called the Natural and Environmental Research Council. A project, and the title is Circadian Disruption by Light Pollution, Extent, Consequences, and Mitigation in Songbirds. And here we're really trying to use a comparative, do a comparative study, look at different species at the same time, study how the urban environment and light pollution have an impact on their daily rhythms of both activity, but we also measure body temperature, energy expenditure, lots of different types of rhythms, basically. But we're also going to do some experiments to test what the long-term health consequences of being active at night are, and also try to do experiments to attempt to understand how we can implement different mitigation strategies in order to reduce these potential long-term health effects. And these potential long-term health effects really come from the evidence from the biomedical sector. This evidence from the human health studies that disrupting natural circadian rhythms of activity and rest can really be detrimental for our own health. But the key question is whether we might also find some similar effects also for wildlife. And we are doing this in Glasgow. We have a gradient of study sites between the city center of Glasgow and Loch Lomond, where the research station of the university is. The color that you see in these maps is light pollution, actually, as seen from a satellite in the sky. So you can see how we basically cover a nice gradient in light pollution along these study sites. And I want to basically finish by, again, I kind of mentioned these different things during my talk, but I want to give you a bit more a synthesis about what can we do to minimize the impact of light pollution. And this, I guess, would be also very relevant for you and for the work that you're trying to do. And I'm going to focus on basically 4 main mitigation measures. And I also would suggest you to visit this website. It's the website of the Dark Sky Organization, who are really doing amazing work on this topic and promoting and doing sensibilization work with the public, and also working a lot, as a link between us scientists and, for instance, city council and policymakers. We try to basically transmit the evidence from science to whoever has to make a decision about public lighting. And these 4 different areas of opportunities are: first, when and if to use light at all; second, the light intensity; the third is the design of these street lamps, the actual physical design; and fourth is the color of light. And this is very topical, all these questions and relevance for policy making is really topical. There's a lot of discussion in the government also going on right now, to create, specific legislation, which is currently missing in the UK, at least. In some other countries, there are some more restrictive rules in terms of light pollution with clear guidelines. In the UK, this is not the case yet. And so there's some members of parliament that are really urging government to take this issue seriously. And the first issue to think about is when and if we need to use light. So there's a lot of ongoing discussion and implementation of novel lighting strategies by city council to use par-night lighting as a way to minimize the impact of light pollution. And at the same time, obviously, it's good for city council because they can save money, right? Some city council have started to basically shut off the lights after midnight. And obviously, there is quite some concern from the public in terms of crime risk. People are obviously often scared to walk and be out at night in very dark areas. And it's not my intention to say that that's not the case or should not be the case. Obviously, this is a problem that we need to take into consideration. But I also want to point out that the scientific evidence for a clear link between the presence of lights and a reduction of crime risk is currently actually very weak. There's not much evidence that links, in the fact that we put more lights out there doesn't mean that we reduce crime. And obviously, that also doesn't mean that we should remove the lights altogether, but it's something to consider, and par-night lighting perhaps could be one way to go forward. There's also ongoing discussion about light intensity and implementing policies to decrease light intensity when it's not needed to have them so bright. And in many areas, especially for instance, parking lots, where often you see so many street lamps and very bright, and here clearly it begs the question whether we need so many street lamps in the first place, and whether we can perhaps tune the intensity down to reduce potential ecological impacts. This is one example of one consultation that is there was, I think it happened in last year. It was in Sheffield. I don't know the outcome of this, but I know that they were asking the public about their opinion on reducing light intensities in basically public streets. The lamp design is one, I think, of the most effective way of reducing the impact of light pollution, and especially the impact of sky glow and light trespass. So basically bringing light in a place that is not needed. Right. So this is an example of these some street lamps. I think this is New Orleans in the States, where you have, this light, they might look beautiful, but this light goes basically everywhere where it's not needed. It goes towards the sky, and it has a tremendous impact on flying animals like insects, like bats, like birds, and it's really not needed. So there's a lot of push from us as scientists, but like organization like the Dark Sky organization, to really push for the use of a street lamp design that only really direct the lights towards the ground where it's needed, and to avoid these lights that are basically directed everywhere, including towards the sky. And last but not least, the wavelength of light, and this is again one big issue currently, because I'm going to mention in the next slide what is the current sort of big problem. First, I just want to mention that obviously it's evident that different types of light colors are used. So this is a picture I took last night from my window. You can clearly see that in any area of a city you might have different colors of light. This warm white light, as well as this very cool white type of light sources. And for instance, for one of the group of animals that seems to be mostly negatively impacted by light pollution, insects, it seems that there is a clear relationship in many different types of insects. This is an example on moths, but it's true for many different types of insects, where by tuning the spectrum of the lights towards warm colors, we dramatically decrease this phototactic behavior of insects. So we dramatically increase the number of insects that are attracted to these light sources. So in other words, it's best to use these warm light colors instead of this very cool white light. This is an example from my hometown, actually, Milan in Italy. This push towards changing this, the old type of illumination is happening all over the world because of what I mentioned before. These LED lights are very energy efficient. City council, they can really save the money, a lot of money, by switching to LED lights. And so many of the city councils, they are currently doing this switch, but we really think that this is a missing opportunity, because a lot of these conversions are done in the wrong way, because these new LED installations are mostly using cool white LED lights, which we know from the studies that I just show you to be bad for wildlife, and especially for insects. As I said, this is an example from my hometown that within a few years, all the lights in the city center were replaced, and they're all basically being replaced using this cool white LED type of sources. And it doesn't take really much. It's just a matter of as scientists, we also need to do a better job to communicate this evidence to the public and to policymakers. But there is a window of opportunity here because of this ongoing switch. We have the opportunity to tune these lights, both in terms of intensity, in terms of wavelength, in terms of the design of the actual lamp in the right way, so to minimize the ecological impacts of light pollution. And to avoid potential ecological disaster. This is an example of China, where they are apparently planning to launch into the sky these artificial moons to basically replace streetlights. And this is obviously nonsense. There has been actually some quantification about the potential impact that this might have on the amount of light pollution, and they basically say that this might make the overall light pollution in an average Chinese city 50 times worse to what it already is. So these sort of things are obviously what we want to avoid, but also in countries not like China, but like the UK, that are not thinking about obviously this totally nonsense. There is an opportunity definitely to try to tune this, especially these new type of lights that are being installed in the right way. And with that, I would like just to thank all the people who work with me towards this these studies and producing these results, my funders as well. And I'm really pleased to be here tonight, and I'm very happy to also answer your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Davide. That was very interesting, and I think, yeah, very, very thought-provoking. I'm going to open the floor to any questions anyone might have. If you've got a question, just unmute yourself and speak, please.
Yeah, Becca?
Can I ask, start up just to, do LED lights, have they been shown to have any benefit over halogen lights, or is there no evidence for any benefit there?
Compared to halogen lights?
Or any other types of lights?
Again, it really much depends on the spectrum of light. I don't think that there is there's much known about a direct comparison of halogen and LED lights in terms of ecological impacts using these light sources of the same wavelength. Okay, so there might be some comparison of halogen versus a general LED light, but as I stressed in the talk, without really standardizing the measurement for the wavelength of light, is different to really compare. But what is clear is that this switch to LEDs that will become more and more common because they're more energy efficient, they're cheaper. There is the opportunity to tune it towards the right spectrum.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Davide, do you know whether insects are particularly attracted to moving light sources, such as cars driving at night? Is the movement an issue?
That's a good question. I would definitely think so. And I think, yeah, just on top of my head, when I think about when I observe animals at night, which I do often because I'm often out at night, I can definitely say that. It depends on the speed of movement. Obviously, if an object is moving very fast, also these animals and insects, especially because they have a smaller eye, so their integration time of any visual cue is much slower compared to our. So the speed of the moving object is key, but it's definitely the case that they are able to track moving light objects.
Okay, I'm certainly aware that, for example, my car is less insect covered than it used to be in years. And I have wondered, is that a daytime effect or a nighttime effect? And is it the case that the insects are being attracted to their death because they're heading towards the light and the light's heading towards them at speed?
So,
isn't it just there's horrifically less insects around?
Yes, that is.
Yeah, but I'm kind of getting at why is that?
Well, okay,
have cars been killing insects continuously?
Yeah, I think partly that's one of the evidence that we have, but there's more. I think it's far from me and claiming that there's only a light pollution problem. As I also mentioned in one of my slides, there's a lot of other environmental, human impacts on the environment that are detrimental, including for insects. So, for instance, pesticides or like intensive agriculture. These are all things that have contributed over the last few decades to the decline of insects. But light pollution has also been a problem.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe you're just driving slower as well. I know I am.
That helps.
Like Miss Daisy.
Holly asked about uplighters in gardens, which she often used, or uplighters can be used in gardens to light up trees as a focal point and what have you. From one of your latest slides, it would suggest that those are very damaging to wildlife.
Yeah, so that's, one of the things that really has emerged in the last 10 years of research is that as much as we can reduce this sort of this uplift illumination, I think that the better it is. And this is reducing sky glow, as I mentioned, definitely one of the things that might have a detrimental impact on wildlife, but also just direct, upward illumination might distract or misleading, flying animals. For instance, these migrating birds that I show you in one of these very strong slides that I show you.
Joe has asked, has there been any research on the impact of light in gardens in relation to hibernating animals, such as hedgehogs, particularly in view of their present decline?
No, not that I'm aware of. It's a very good question, and but no, I think overall, mammals in this field have definitely been an understudied group of animals. They have been studied in the context of urban ecology, but in the context of light pollution overall, I think compare especially to birds or insects, definitely we need to do something more about it. There's some research on bats and some research on mice, but other mammals very little.
That's great.
Can I ask a question, David?
Yeah, please.
It was a really interesting talk. Thanks for that.
Thanks.
Which of the 6 bird species that you're going to be doing your is it called a NERCS study?
Yeah, so it's going to be the very common urban birds. There's the blackbird, there's the European robin, there's the great-tit, the blue-tit, the dannock, and the chaffinch. It's all birds basically that are quite common in urban areas, but also birds that we can catch in the forest as a control, basically.
Yeah. And I suppose there'll be winners and losers, won't there, on both sides of, it might be that, do you think the more insectivorous birds will end up being the winners because of the detrimental effect of light on insects? They're easier to prey at night time.
Yeah, that could be one option. I think we don't have really an understanding of that in the context of light pollution. There's definitely some research in the wider field of urban ecology that shows quite clearly that insectivorous birds are really not making it through this urban filter as much as generalist bird species. On average, if you are a generalist animal, you're definitely at advantage during this process of colonizing urban areas, because you fundamentally can rely on a wider diet, right? So possibly what you just said maybe doesn't really work out because there's not so many strictly insectivorous bird species in urban areas where light pollution is also very common. But there's definitely sort of a species dependent effect of light pollution also in birds. For instance, the reason why we are using these 6 different species for our current project is because we have evidence that some species are affected by light pollution more than others. So for instance, species like the European robin or the blackbird, you hear them singing during the night a lot more compared to species like chaffinches or sparrows. That you basically, you never hear them, you never see them at night. They're strictly diurnal birds.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we are thinking is playing a role is the size of the eye. For instance, blackbirds and robins, relative to their body mass, to their body size, sorry, they have a relatively larger eye. And this enables them to see when the light intensity is lower.
Right.
Because a larger eye means that more light comes into the eye, and the more sensitive this eye is, the more able you are to create a visual image, basically, in your eye.
Is that sort of a generalization for thrush species?
Yes, that's a good point. So a lot of these thrush species, they do have a larger eye relative to body size, compared, for instance, to sparrow and finch species, where they have a very small eye compared relative to body size.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Can I just ask what you'd mentioned that Philips have been looking into the impact of light. I just wonder if there's any other lighting manufacturers who are actually looking at the impact of their products. And also, just as an idea for us designers, we talked about sustainability and starting to ask suppliers and manufacturers about their impact on carbon footprints, for example. Mm-hmm. So maybe this is something that we can start asking, what is the impact of light pollution of your product? Now, we know they're not going to be able to answer it, but they'll start thinking about looking at these kind of questions. So do you know if there's any other companies that are starting to look?
So as far as I'm aware, the other one that I know is investing a bit of sort of money and time into developing sort of wildlife-friendly sources is Osram. Okay. But honestly, I don't know of other companies. But I bet that there are. I mean, Philips has always been in this context a company that has invested a lot into producing different types of light bulbs that are beneficial both for wildlife and also for human health. So they produce also a lot of lights to treat skin diseases, for instance. So they've always been a company that has paid attention to developing alternative light sources. And I think other companies are following. Osram is an example. I'm sure that there are more. I'm just not aware.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting you to have a list you could put off your head, but I think that is something that we can probably do as designers, is start asking our suppliers that question. Yeah. So just wanted to put that out there. Thanks, Davide.
Yeah. Thanks.
I think I'm going to start to wrap it up, and I think in just on a message that came through as well, I think as designers, not only can we be asking the suppliers about the effects of the light, but also we can consider where we're putting our lights in our gardens, educating our clients, particularly those ones who want a bit of mood lighting but also want a garden for wildlife, how we can, they sort of contradict to each other, and we can try and reduce or try to educate them so that they will switch off their lights. We can put in controllers so that it's not an all or nothing, so every single light goes on in the garden and it's on all night, that kind of thing. And then obviously selecting wavelength of the lamps and keeping the intensity as low as possible to offer that little bit of, you can spend your time in the garden for a little bit longer in the evening, but switch it off when you go in. And hopefully that's some food for thought, and maybe we can discuss this further as amongst ourselves as designers, what best way we can include lighting in gardens if we can't persuade the client not to have lights in the garden. So sorry, I rambled on there, but thank you very much, Davide.
Thank you. And
staying on.
Thanks. I just want to mention that feel free to write to me. I think Rachel you can share my email address with everybody. If you have any questions or you want to follow up, please contact me.
Thank you, Davide.
Thank you very much.